In the fourth screencast, we're going to address a question that I was hoping possibly occurred to you as we went through the first three screencasts, and maybe not. And along the way, we're going to try to relate long-run aggregate supply to production possibility curves, which we haven't seen for a very long time. So the question that I'm hoping occurred to you is essentially this. Are we stuck at a certain level of GDP? The story that I've told so far is that in the end, we're always going back to this blue line that we're calling long-run aggregate supply, which is a certain level of stuff, a certain level of GDP, the amount of GDP that we'd produce if we had full employment. So the question is this where the economy is going to be forever? The answer is an emphatic no. Economic growth is possible. It is possible to make more or less stuff even in the long run. So I want to show you how that would be represented in both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph on the one hand, and also relate that back to production possibility curves on the other. So let's start off at full employment. Let's start off at an equilibrium that would represent full employment. And let's say something happens in the economy. Nanorobots get invented and they vastly increase the productivity of every single industry. Thinking about how that would affect our model, we've just learned that it's now easier or cheaper to produce. We have these amazing new nanorobots. So in the short run aggregate supply would shift to the right. Easier, cheaper to produce, aggregate supply shifting to the right. We'd move from point A to point B. Now, the idea here is that if that change is permanent, if those nanorobots are going to be around forever, we can make more stuff, and that's not going to change. That's going to be an increase in our productive ability that'll be permanent. And the way that we'd represent that in our graph is to shift long-run aggregate supply to the right. In fact, that's how we're going to represent economic growth. That's a higher level of GDP. That's more stuff at full employment. Still, given our 5% unemployment, we're able to make more goods and services because we have this amazing new technology. Economic growth is represented by a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. Point B might be our new long-run equilibrium. So then the question is, well, what could possibly do that? What can get us more economic growth? What can get us to produce more goods and services? And the answer is the exact same things that pushed the production possibility curve out back when we learned about production possibility curves. Now you do remember production possibility curves, don't you? Happened at the very beginning of microeconomics. We did an activity, we made links, we made smiles. Anything? Well, if you don't remember, let me try to remind you. Here's what a production possibility curve looked like. We simplified the economy by assuming that there were only two goods that could be produced. Maybe we'd call those capital goods and consumer goods. You'll remember that being on the curve meant that we were being productively efficient, producing as much as we possibly could. Being inside the curve was bad. Being outside the curve was basically impossible. The way that we represented economic growth with production possibility curves was by pushing the production possibility curve out and to the right. The ability to make more of both things, in this case, both capital goods and consumer goods. That's what economic growth looked like at the beginning of microeconomics. So if you remember, the things that pushed that production possibility curve out and to the right were things that increased our productive capacity. Things like more resources, finding more workers, more steel, more oil. Or finding more productive workers or more productive resources, sending our workers back to school, having higher productivity, the ability to produce more. Technological gains were something that pushed the production possibility curve out and to the right. The invention of the internet or the invention of nanorobots. You'll also remember that producing capital goods versus consumer goods, the ant versus the grasshopper story. Focusing on capital goods increased our productive capacity into the future. And what we're going to find out in the next unit is that international trade as well can push the production possibility curve out and to the right. These are all exactly the same things that push long-run aggregate supply to the right as well. And so we now have two ways of representing economic growth. One way to represent economic growth is by a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. An equivalent way to represent economic growth would be an outward shift of the production possibilities curve. AP exam is very fond of this relationship between PPCs and LRAS. Bottom line here, LRAS shifting to the right means economic growth. The production possibility curve shifting out also means economic growth. The same exact factors cause both of them to change. That is it for this relatively short screencast.
That's not fair that I failed the test. You said that I got question 1 wrong.
You did. The Bolshevik Revolution did not result in democracy in Russia.
But a friend told me that D would be the answer.
I am aware that you were trying to cheat. That is why I changed the answers before you took the test.
That's not fair.